Do you have a lot of jelly rolls laying around? Hi, my name is Fallon and I love to quilt, and today I'm going to share two different quilt patterns with you that are very similar using jelly rolls. My favorite quilt block to sew with jelly rolls is a 9-patch. So I'm going to share with you two different 9-patch patterns that are both on point, but they are assembled in different ways. And I just think it's so fun that you can get the same look, the same quilt pattern, but with two very different methods. So let me show you the jelly rolls I'm going to be using in this tutorial. The first jelly roll is Ridgewood, and I'm going to be pairing this jelly roll with some beautiful solid cream fabric. It's going to go together very nicely. The second jelly roll is Flower Pot, and you can see it is a petite jelly roll, so I am going to be using two of them. And the fabric I'm using with this one is a beautiful kind of tan with polka dots, a very beautiful tone-on-tone. So the first pattern I'm going to share with you is a pattern by Missouri Star Quilt Company, and this one is assembled so that you don't have to sew the rows together on the diagonal. It comes together very quick. I think you'll love seeing how it comes together. And then the second pattern I'm going to share with you is assembled on point, but using diagonal rows. So I think you'll really enjoy seeing this come together in two different ways, and you'll have a way to get this same look, but not having to sew any rows on the diagonal if you're uncomfortable doing that. To get started on both of these quilt patterns, the first thing you will want to do is cut your background fabric. Now for the Missouri Star Quilt Company pattern, all of the cutting instructions are provided in the pattern. And I will tell you, the cutting for this pattern is a bit easier because the only thing you'll have to cut is strips to piece the 9 patches together and squares that you will cut corner to corner. So just squares like this that you will cut corner to corner. Very easy cutting. Now with the 9-patch on point pattern that is pieced with diagonal rows, there is definitely a bit more cutting. Again, you'll have to cut 2.5-inch by width of fabric strips for this pattern, and you will need 15 of those. And then you'll need 42 6.5-inch squares. And for this pattern, you will also need side triangles and corner triangles. You will of course need 4 corner triangles, and to get those you'll need to cut 2 5.5-inch squares, and then you will cut those on the diagonal once to get your corner triangles. And then for the side triangles you will cut 7 10.5-inch squares, and you will cut them on the diagonal twice for your side triangles. Now the first thing you'll want to do is start getting your 9 patches ready, and the 9 patches are constructed the same way for both patterns. To construct the 9 patches, you will first sew some strip sets together. When I'm constructing the strip sets, I first like to divide out all the colors from my jelly roll. So I did that for both the Flower Pot jelly roll and the Ridgewood jelly roll. Now you'll be piecing together 2 different strip sets. You will need to construct 7 of those strip sets that will have a print, a background fabric, and a print. And then for the strip set in the center of the 9 patch, you will be piecing 4 strip sets that have a background fabric, a print fabric, and then a background fabric. When sewing these long strip sets together, they can often get really wavy if the 2 strips of fabric aren't fed through the sewing machine nice and even. So I'm going to give you 2 tips for preventing that waviness. What I typically like to do is to hold the strip sets together with one hand, and I kind of hold it up toward me a little bit. I make sure they're nice and even, and then with my other hand I keep it placed down on the sewing machine near the presser foot, and I hold the fabric together firmly there, making sure it gets fed through evenly. Now, if you don't want to do that and you want to be extra careful, you can definitely place some pins in the strips to hold them together. Just make sure you pull them out and don't sew over them when you are sewing. Now, once you get all of your strip sets sewn together, make sure you press them really well. You will want to press all of the seams toward the print fabric. This will help you nest them together really well when you're sewing the 9 patches together. After you get the fabric pressed really well, it's time to cut each of the strip sets down into 2.5-inch segments. Once you get all those segments cut, lay them out on a design board with the background print on the outsides and the background print background strip sets in the center. And you can get them all rearranged how you would like to sew them together into 9 patches to keep it nice and organized. All right, so I have my fabric all organized and it is time to sew these 9 patches together. I like to strip piece these together. So what I do is I lay my first row on one side of me and then the center on the other, and I can just place them right sides together and sew. Since we pressed the fabric toward the print fabric, they nest together nicely at the seams, and you can feel that there isn't much bulk there at all to sew these together nice and easily with perfect little points. Okay, so then I would just keep sewing all of these together, but I'm just going to do 2 for now so that I can show you how to bring these completely together and show you one of the 9 patches finished. But normally I would chain piece these and sew the first and the middle row together for all of these segments. So I'm going to separate these, put these back on my design board just so I can keep them organized, and I'll grab 2 of the 3rd rows to sew these 9 patches together. So I'm going to press the seam there and you can see the 9 patch coming together, and then we'll just sew on the other side. So sew that on, lay it right sides together. I'm going to feel and make sure the seams are lined up, and I'll get some nice points there, and sew. All right, so I'm going to finger press these over, and then I'll add some heat and press these really well, but you can see how beautiful that 9 patch came together. Absolutely love this fabric. All right, so here's the 9 patch. I'm going to go ahead and get all of these 9 patches sewn. Again, they are sewn the same way for either pattern. Once I get all of the 9 patches sewn, I'll show you what is different between piecing the quilt top between each pattern. I'm so excited to show you how they come together, and I can't wait to hear from you on which method you think you would use or which method you like better. Okay, so let's start piecing the quilt that is going to be pieced on the diagonal first. We're going to do this one first because I find it a little harder to lay out because all of those squares we cut are turned on point and the 9 patches are turned on point. Plays with my mind a little bit to lay it out, so I really like to lay it out on a design wall on the floor, get the layout I like. And for me, it's easiest to start in a corner and start laying it out. So I have the quilt all laid out. It's laid out in a way I like. So now it's time to start piecing it. When I piece this together, I start in a corner as well. Now, here is the corner I'm going to piece together first. And we're going to take our corner triangle, fold it right sides together, and give it a little crease. We're finding the center of it. And then we're going to do the same thing with the 9 patch along the side that we're going to sew it to. All right, and so then now you can see that those line up with the centers, the 2 creases we have there. So I'm going to lay it right sides together. And since I'm not right by my sewing machine, I'm going to add some pins in here so it doesn't move around. I don't want it to get all lined up and then take it over to the sewing machine and have to readjust it again and make sure it's lined up. So at the sewing machine, I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam along here, and then I'm going to go ahead and press it. Now, I feel like once we get that corner triangle sewn on the first corner of the quilt, all the sewing that comes next kind of makes more sense and gets a little bit easier. You can start seeing the rows come together and everything lines up a little bit easier. So the next one we're going to sew on is these side triangles. So these I find a little bit easier than the corner triangles because here you have this right angle on the block that you're going to line up the triangle with, and then sew right along here. Now don't worry about the triangle hanging over. It is fine. It is supposed to do that. Just focus on this corner meeting up really well. So I'm going to put some pins in and sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. And then this triangle over here is going to go on the same way. So notice how I move that out of the way just to make sure I don't accidentally sew over it. And I'm going to put some pins in here because I'm going to sew across here as well. So it's lined up right there in the corner. So notice here that I'm kind of working a little bit of this layout at a time. Normally, when I'm working on rows that are just straight rows, not rows on the diagonal, I will put a marker on the first block in the first row, stack them all up, and go over to the sewing machine and sew them all in order. And I'll do the same with the second row. I've shown this before in videos, but here I like to work slowly and make sure I keep everything organized. I don't stack the rows and work on them all at once. I just find this process works better for me to keep everything organized and not mess up my rows. So I'm going to get these sewn a 1/4 inch seam along each side and press them. And I'll show you working on one more row just to show you a little bit more how this quilt comes together on the diagonal. All right, so here it is. Got one corner coming together. Okay, so let's sew the next row on this quilt, and then I'll move on to showing you the Missouri Star Quilt Company's on point version of the 9 patch. So I have the next row laid out here, and it really comes together easy as long as you get your layout figured out. The rows really come together pretty easy. I know I keep saying it's pretty hard for me to work on these quilts on the diagonal, and it is definitely more of a mind game, but once you get going, it does come together pretty easy. So I have the next row laid out, and it really helps me to have it laid out visually so I can see it to make sure it's coming together right. So again, I'm going to take one of the corner triangles and line it up with my 9 patch. Lay it right sides together, and we're going to sew right along here. And that's what the thing that can get mixed up, because you could think I sew along here, but we're sewing along this side. And how I keep myself straight is by keeping everything laid out next to me, because if I get distracted, if one of my kids come up while I'm in the middle of sewing, if I keep the quilt laid out instead of stacking all the rows, I can remember where I left off. I can put the block back over here and be like, okay, I need to sew along this side. All right, so I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. And you can press as you go if you want, or you can press after you get the whole row together. It's really up to you. It really depends on how I'm feeling that day. I'm gonna go ahead and just get this pressed so I have that all together and I can bring the 2 rows together. All right, and I'm not gonna just add on the next block. I'm gonna lay this up here and make sure I sewed it on right, because I don't want to get the whole row sewn and realize I mixed something up, because more than likely if I mix something up, I'm gonna keep mixing it up. So it's looking good. So I'm gonna lay the next block on the 9 patch, and it's one of my tone-on-tone background squares, and sew across here. And once you get that side triangle on, the row comes together really quickly, because that's really the only piece that really makes your mind work on what side you're sewing it on. Once the row starts coming together, it's really easy. So got that one sewn. I'm going to finger press the seam just to get it working in the direction I want, and then I'm going to press it with some heat. All right, and so I'm going to put the next 9 patch on, the next square in the row, and sew. I'm going to press. Now I'm pressing my 9 patches in toward the solid blocks. If I keep doing that throughout this, my seams are going to nest together very nicely when I bring rows together. All right, so you can see my row coming together very nicely. So I'm going to lay it down here just to make sure that I sew on the side triangle correctly. So I'm just going to lay it right sides together, and then I know I need to sew along here, and I make sure that I have a nice right angle here. All the seams are meeting up nicely. And then I'm just gonna sew my 1/4 inch seam. All right, so then I have 1 full row done. And don't worry about these sticking out here. It's all going to come together properly, I promise you. So the last thing I want to show you before I move on to the Missouri Star Quilt Company's pattern is bringing these 2 rows together. So what we're going to do here is I like to focus on the seams meeting up first. So instead of starting at the ends over here, lining those up, I'm going to focus on the seams here and pinning those. So like I said, because I'm pressing out toward the background fabric, these seams nest together very nicely. You can feel them come together. You can feel where those points are going to meet, and then I'm just going to pop a pin in there. And I'm going to do the same over here. And I work longer rows the same way. I'll line this up and start working from the center, meeting these seams together, pinning and working out toward the end. And here's why I do that. Because at the end of this triangle, it's going to overhang on the end. And if I tried to work from the ends of these rows, I might want to start pinning where they meet evenly, and that's just not going to line up properly throughout the row, and it's going to be out of whack. So I start at seams and work out, and it's going to overhang, but that's probably about a 1/4 inch overhang there. So when I sew across there, it's actually going to end right where it's supposed to, and this row will line up nicely. And we'll see how that looks after I sew all the way across here, but it's the same on the other end. We have a bit of overhang, and that's okay. It just doesn't seem right that it's uneven at the end. I'm used to sewing straight rows together, and hopefully if we did good with sewing and cutting and pressing and all of that, the rows will line up even. Doesn't always happen, but it just seems so weird to have that overhang there, but it's supposed to. So I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across here. So I'm pulling the pins out when I get to them. And let's see here when I finger press this, how it lines up along the end there. So we're pretty straight. I mean, we have these little pieces that stick out there, but I think after I get this pressed well, if I trim those little ears off, dog ears off, I think it will meet up nicely. We got some pretty nice points there. Over here, it's lined up good. And honestly, I'm probably going to square this quilt up when it's all finished to be a 1/4 inch trimmed, so everything should be nice and straight anyway. I'll probably trim a 1/4 inch away from the point, square this up, and put a thin border on, and then a wider border on this quilt. But it's looking really good. Let me press this and give you a little look at it. So here's how it would look when it's sitting all pieced together. Kind of want to show it like this, but this is how it's actually going to be sitting in the quilt. So there we go. We have one whole corner of this quilt put together. I'm going to keep sewing this together, but first we're going to take a look at how we're going to bring the Missouri Star Quilt Company's pattern together. It's so funny having two completely different techniques for bringing a 9 patch on point together, but you get the same look in the end. Okay, so to bring this quilt together, you're going to need your 9 patch and those triangles we cut. That's all you're going to need to bring this quilt together. Comes together so easy. At the end of this video, I'll give the pros and cons to me on each method, but I think you're really going to like how easily this comes together. So what I like to do is bring together the layout on a design board, and I have 4 of the triangles around the 9 patch. I actually have a few here that I'm going to finish, but that I still need to finish. But we have the triangles around the edges, and that's going to give you a square and a square. And the square and a square will bring the 9 patch together on point without having to sew on the diagonal or anything like that. Now to do this, what I like to do is take the 9 patch and fold it in half, kind of like we did with that corner triangle. And I finger press the sides. If you need to press a little more with the iron with some heat to be able to see them really well, go ahead and do that if you need to. And then we're going to take one of the triangles and we're going to fold it and press along that longer end. Try not to stretch it, just give a gentle little finger press there or with the iron. And then those creases are going to show you how to meet these both in the middle to sew your 1/4 inch seam. So we're going to sew along each side of the 9 patch. And I like to sew along opposite ends while I have the sewing machine going, and then I'll press them. So again, I folded that in half. I'm going to meet up where the creases are and sew along here. This is so important to do. I know this seems like a tedious step, but trust me, go ahead and make sure you find the middles and line it up even. If you don't, your square is going to turn out a little cockeyed. I promise it will. I have done it. I have tried to just eyeball it, but make sure you just don't skip this step, because it'll save you a lot of grief later when you're squaring these up to size. All right, and then I'm gonna press these. And so now your block is looking like this. And now we're going to add on the triangles on the opposite side. So again, I fold this in half and press just with my fingers. I can usually see the crease pretty well with just pressing with my fingers. And then we're going to add on the triangles on those two sides. So fold the triangle in half and finger press, line up those creases. And sew a 1/4 inch seam. And just a note here, I can see a lot of this red fabric overhanging here. And I know because it's a lot darker than my background fabric that I'll see that through here. I don't want to see that through here, so I'm gonna go ahead and trim it. I'll fold back my white fabric a little and trim away there. And so there, now I won't have to worry about that red showing through once I get this all finished and quilted. So let's go back and we're gonna add on the triangle to the last side. Sometimes you just have to take care of things like that right away, because if you think, I'll just do that later, and then you forget, and then you quilt your quilt, and then you're like, oh no. All right, so I'm gonna sew a 1/4 inch seam along this last side. Finger press and give this block a final press here. All right, so here is the finished block for the Missouri Star pattern. And it does look like you could just move on here, that you could be finished with building these blocks, and you are finished with building the block, but I highly recommend you look at the pattern and see what size this block should be squared up to and square it up to that size. It's another one of those kind of tedious tasks, but it's a task that makes so much sense if you just take the time to do it. The pattern will tell you exactly what size the block should be, and it honestly is probably going to be very close to that size, but we're working with bias edges, and you know, things can get wonky. Maybe you aren't pressing perfect, maybe you aren't cutting perfect, and all of that is fine, but taking this extra step will make up for all of that and save you a lot of stress when you bring this quilt together. So that is it. I didn't have to trim much away at all. There's barely any fabric there, but I promise you, those little bits, 1/8 of an inch, whatever it is, will bring your rows off just a little bit and give you a headache if you don't take this step to trim these up. All right, so we have all these blocks. Now what? So this version will come together so easy. You're just gonna lay the rows out, sew the rows together, and you'll have a quilt top. So just lay it out and bring it together. So simple. So I have both versions of this quilt finished, and it is a little hard to get them both up at the same time, but I think you'll be able to see them pretty well to see what I'm talking about with the difference between both of the methods for bringing this 9 patch on point together. So for the Missouri Star Quilt Company's version of this pattern, I have a few pros for you. First, the cutting was very easy. I only had to cut the background fabric for the 9 patch and the triangles to bring the block together. Also, laying out that quilt was very easy as well. I just had those blocks that went in a layout in a straight line, so getting it up on my design board was much easier. With that, thinking about how to sew the rows together was pretty easy as well. I just stacked them up on a design board and was able to sew them. So it really came together pretty easy. Now, when it comes to the cons with the Missouri Star Quilt Company pattern, I do want to emphasize that when I say I'm talking about cons here, it isn't really a con with the pattern or how it is written or anything like that. It's just kind of little hiccups I came to with bringing the quilt together. So it's not a negativity about the pattern. It's just things that I think you should look for when you're deciding which method you would want to use and which ones fit your skill sets better. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, when it comes to cons with this pattern, sewing these triangles along the edge here, you are working with a bias seam there. So when you're sewing, it can get a little wonky. My blocks were a little wonky. Now that is corrected when you trim up the block, but keep in mind when you're trimming too, you can be off a little bit. So even though you're bringing that block to size, there can be some issues there that come up. And I did see them come up when I was sewing the blocks together. Some of the points don't want to meet perfectly. So if you are somebody who really wants your points to come together perfectly, that is something to think about with this one. You have to be very careful with your sewing and your trimming, and when you're sewing the rows together, you'll want to pin a lot to make sure those points come together perfectly. Now for me, it's not too big of an issue. I'm only pointing it out because there was a very big difference between the two on how easy it was to get the points to come together. I feel like when this quilt comes together as a whole, those issues aren't noticeable very much, but I know for some people it is very important for them for the points to meet up, and that is okay. So I want to be very transparent here. If I were to sew this pattern again, I would use the diagonal method, and I was actually very surprised about that. I think I pointed out a few times as I was filming clips for this tutorial that I don't love piecing quilts along the diagonal. I often sometimes will avoid patterns like that unless it's one I really want to make. So it's not a method I love, but for this pattern, I think it really came together much nicer using this method. So I will try to explain to you why I think that, but I was honestly very surprised. So for the pros on the method that is diagonally pieced, I feel like it has a much more clean look. Because you're using just two different blocks for the center of this quilt to bring the main part of the design together, you have these squares here and then the 9 patch. And the squares are just a solid square. So if you wanted to use a background fabric with a design or like a tone on tone like I used here, it's not broken up by the squares coming together with triangles bringing it together. So I think you get a really clean look. And even though this quilt is pieced on the diagonal, I felt like the blocks came together much easier. I didn't have to fuss a lot to bring the points together, so it really looks nice and cohesive, much more effortlessly than it was bringing this one together. Now for the cons with this version, I do feel like it is a lot more of a challenge to lay the quilt out before piecing it together. So when I put it up on the design board, it was kind of leaning to the side. I started in a corner and worked out, but it just gradually started leaning. I had to keep adjusting things because I would mess up the layout. It doesn't come natural to me to lay out the rows at a diagonal. And because of that, because it's more challenging for me, it does take longer to bring it together. And I'm also less likely to move around the blocks if I'm not happy with the layout, because it takes a while to bring it all back together again. Overall though, with either quilt pattern, I think you'll get a beautiful quilt that you'll be happy with. I think it is really fun to see that there are two very different methods to bring this one design together. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What do you think are the pros and cons of both? And if you decide to make this pattern, which method would you choose? If you would like to sew the Missouri Star Quilt Company's pattern together, all the cutting information is found in their pattern, and I will put a link in the description of this video to their website so you can grab the pattern. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Empty hearts and neon lights.